Book 1, Chapter 1 of The Position of Peggy Harper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. Book 1, Chapter 1. A gentleman who had been called to the bar, expecting to make a great name and a large fortune, died obscurely, leaving the sum of £57 8s. 6d, a widow and a son. His other surviving relative was a married sister. This lady said to her husband, who was lucratively associated with hops, "You had better find a berth for Christopher in the office, George." Christopher Tatham had come down abruptly from Oxford, where George Spalding and his wife, not unreasonably, considered that it was preposterous to have sent him, and had seemed to view his proposed introduction to the office in a proper light. Then, in a burst of confidence one day, he avowed to his aunt that, from his childhood, he had been ambitious to go on the stage. And he did not go into the office. Uncle George had an open mind and sons of his own to share the profits of hops, and he said, "Well, if he has any talent that way, the best thing he can do is to become an actor. There's no future for him in the business, you know. Tell him to come and stay with us while he looks round." The process of looking round, as conducted by a novice, led to nothing but fruitless interviews with needy persons who advertised for "amateurs of ability," and sought simpletons of means, but Mr. Spalding occasionally met footlight favourites at Masonic dinners, and generously he proceeded to make himself a nuisance to them. "A young protégé of mine, who is an aspirant for histrionic honours," figured in his discourse so often that several theatrical celebrities grew profane when they found they were to sit next to him. His persistence at last secured a chance for Tatham to make his début at a fashionable theatre as an "extra gentleman," in which capacity he received £1 a week, and his principal duty was to simulate enjoyment of an imitation ice cream composed of pink cotton wool. Extra gentlemen are supernumeraries of some refinement, who possess dress clothes of their own, and don't look like waiters when they're meant to represent Lady Alethea's guests. The widow, meanwhile, had been living in a boarding house on the balance of the £57 8s. 6d. Her son took 15 shillings of his salary to her every Sunday, and continued to be sheltered by the Spaldings. The career of the comedy was discomfitingly brief, and the one that followed it extended no hospitality to guests. But after an anxious interval the aspirant obtained an opportunity, thanks to Masonic dinners again, to play small parts, at small terms, in a stock company in the East End. His first appearance there was made as Ginger Bill in the Romany Rye, and when he put on the corduroys and the carroty wig that didn't fit him, the evil heat of the dressing room and the smell of the other actors' fried fish and chips intensified the sickness of his terror. However, his performance of a hooligan gave satisfaction, though he had amused the East End company at rehearsal by having to inquire the meaning of the word Barney in his part. The audience paid him the compliment of calling him before the curtain in the rôle of Ginger Bill. They approved him moderately in various rôles that he sustained during the season. And then, one red-letter night, a provincial actress, who had come to the theatre to star in a sensational drama of her own composition, offered him an engagement to tour in it. It was a testimonial. There was jealousy. "She'd have liked to get me," declared a favourite of Whitechapel, devouring his pennyworth of fried fish, "but she said, 'I know what it is, you London actors won't leave town.'" In the new engagement the weekly salary was a couple of pounds, and the young man contrived to remit a sovereign each week now to his mother. It was progress. It was felt that Christopher was beginning to get on. Only, when the tour terminated he was, naturally, again without money to live on while he waited for the next. Of course, his uncle and aunt understood the circumstances, and he was told to remember that he had a home to go to. He was told to remember it on subsequent occasions. But actors in their novitiate, without theatrical families to smooth their path, need a home to go to very often, and Tatham, who was denied the possibility of saving anything while an engagement lasted, needed one even oftener than most of them. As time went on, the Spauldings did not actually conclude that he had been misled by vanity and hadn't any aptitude for acting, but they sighed that it was "strange he didn't do better." They did not say bluntly that he was "to blame," but they said disparagingly he was "unlucky." It began to be obvious to them that a young man who had a mother to support would, after all, be more suitably employed in a permanent clerkship than in a precarious profession. And their nephew became acutely conscious of their view. He was acutely conscious of it this evening. Another third-rate tour had reached its last night, and to-morrow he would have to present himself at Regent's Park once more. He sickened to think of it. He was performing a part devoid of human nature, in a melodrama that outraged possibilities, to an audience for whom it was fully good enough. But he had looked forward to better things, and his heart was in his calling, though its apprenticeship was foul. Sentiment possessed him as he spoke the final lines of the Boulder Dash and left the stage, wondering whether he would ever stand upon a stage again. Envy of the other men assailed him, untalented and unambitious as he knew most of them to be. At least they belonged to "the profession." It was their destiny, while his own foothold in it was so insecure. Yes, he had always felt it to be insecure. Even across his brightest moments had rolled the misgiving, "Will it last?" "Galbraith," he said in the dressing room to a tall, spare man seated before a looking glass, "how did you find engagements at the start, before people had heard of you?" Mr. Galbraith, who was habited as a parson, and had still to play in 2 scenes, was smoking a pipe while he dabbed chalk on his hair to betoken anguish induced by a prodigal son. He was a man of education, who had once been a West End actor. His descent was due to drink, a vice which he solemnly renounced as often as compassion entrusted him with another chance to earn his bread. For weeks, and sometimes months at a stretch, he would be a total abstainer, proclaiming barley water his beverage for life, only to succumb in his most confident hour, and be dismissed abusively from one company more. He remained in this one because, when his outbreak occurred, the tour had been so near its end that the manager had shirked the trouble of replacing him, but the spectacle of an intoxicated parson exhorting his son to reformation had injured the week's receipts. "Before people had heard of me, it was easier to find engagements," he exclaimed. "It's since people know me I can't get shopped." "You know what I mean, Galbraith. What can I do? Answering the advertisements in the Era is no use. Nobody ever answers me. It amounts to this: if I don't find something else very soon, I shall have to leave the profession." The imminence of such a catastrophe did not seem to thrill Galbraith. He puffed smoke placidly. "Where were they when you came up?" he asked. "Is it near my cue?" "No, Miss Lane hadn't been on yet. You've heaps of time. Do you think I shall ever do any good, Galbraith?" "You'll do better than you're doing now, boy. I don't think you'll ever play Hamlet." "Look here, I couldn't ask many in the sort of crowds I've been with, but you can tell me. You're a finished actor." "Finished and done for," assented Galbraith cheerfully. "Not if you'd have enough will. Any management would be glad to have you if they could rely on your resolutions. I don't want to fool myself. Tell me the truth. I know I lack experience, and I can't get experience if I don't get parts. But supposing I can hold out, and I do get the experience, am I ever likely to succeed? Do you think I've any gift for the stage?" Galbraith had been before the public for 30 years, but Tatham had put a question that no actor had ever asked him before. He reflected before he spoke. "Laddie," he said, and he had no aspiration to make epigrams, "the greatest gifts for the stage are money and luck. Almost anybody can learn to act fairly well in time, and if you have money you can pay premiums, and you can take a theatre, and you can commission popular authors to write parts that fit you. In a first-class stock company of the old days, Mr. Albert Jerningham would be playing Charles his friend. He has money, or rather he has people behind him with money, and so he's an actor-manager and plays the impassioned hero. Leaving money out of it, luck's the chief thing. With good luck you rise, and with bad luck you stick. Good luck gave Fatty Spencer, who has never played any character but himself in his whole career, the chance to make a hit at the old Diadem. They happened to want just such a personality as his in Pulteney's Lies for a Living. Fatty's very defects shone as priceless merits. The public shrieked at him, and he's been engaged to play himself in other pieces at big terms ever since. Plenty of men who could act him off the stage are feeding at Lockhart's. Tipplers? Improvident? Not a bit of it. Just bad luck. They aren't like me, they haven't themselves to blame. Somehow they never chance to get shopped in a thing that runs. They're engaged for West End shows, they give their time to rehearsals, and they get good notices. But the play's a frost, and in a month or 6 weeks they're out again. Perhaps you suppose they needn't be out for long if the critics praise them. Optimism of youth, Tatham. There's no continuous service of engagements, even for the fatties. Besides, by and by they get known as Jonahs, and that's a reputation that ruined an actor who'd been said by the press to be the greatest tragedian that England had had since Edmund Kean. In his case, as a matter of fact, it was all bunkum, for he'd been in several runs, but he did get called a Jonah, and it settled him. Once let a manager say of a man or woman, "Oh yes, very clever, be excellent in the part, of course, but an unlucky name, never seen in a success," and it's likely to mean a vacation of 12 months in the year. He knocked the dust from his pipe and went leisurely downstairs. Tatham, when he had washed and changed his clothes, returned there too. He did not leave the theatre yet. Most of the players would travel to London in the morning like himself, but others foresaw mean streets in Liverpool and elsewhere, and there were good-byes and good wishes to be exchanged. He loitered in the wings and listened to Galbraith fervidly delivering a speech of hackneyed claptrap, which he ridiculed in the dressing-rooms. The unsophisticated audience greeted its climax with a burst of applause, while behind the wavering walls of the prodigal's narrow chambers a grubby scene-shifter wheeled forward the porch of the Old Home for the final set. The Old Home, to the accompaniment of incidental music, played out of tune by an exiguous orchestra, was duly presented. The faithful housekeeper, who remembered the dear young master when he was a boy, bless his heart, attitudinised at the right of the stage, to hearken jubilantly to a peal of wedding bells, which the prompter, as usual, sounded at the left, and an anxious leading man, on the verge of unemployment, declaimed as a radiant bridegroom to a despondent leading lady whom he might never meet after tonight, that, in the golden years before them, they would never part again. The curtain fell. The company scurried to tear off their costumes and pack their small belongings. Tatham knew that all the men, excepting Galbraith, who had drunk nothing but tea and barley water for 10 days, were impatient to get outside before the bars closed. In their haste to do so, some would neglect to remove their paint. The back of the stage seemed suddenly to have dissolved into the night. The canvas meadows had been holed into the flies, and a real moon displayed confusion in a freezing yard. A vicious wind swept the bare stage as the Old Home and the strong room in the Bank of England were stacked onto a wagon. By 2s and 3s the company reappeared, carrying garments rolled in newspaper, and nondescript luggage made of straw. "Well, ta-ta, dear." "See you some day." "Coming next door, Cully?" Among the last to descend was Elsie Lane, a girl whose characterisation of an Irish waif supplied the one touch of humanity that the piece contained. She, too, had found engagements in the West End, but, unlike Galbraith, she had never had important parts, nor been able to establish herself there, perhaps because she wasn't tall enough, perhaps because she wasn't pretty enough. Certainly not because she wasn't clever enough. She was one of those actresses of whom the critics continued to write, "A capital character sketch was afforded by Miss So and so, who has yet to attain in London the position to which her talents entitle her." When a country actress is out of work and old, and all hope has been dead in her for many years, sometimes she re-reads that criticism in her poor book of press cuttings. Elsie Lane's age now was 7 or 8 and 20, and with her pale, serious face and her quiet manner, she had seemed to Christopher more adapted to a vicarage than to a theatre, until he saw her act. They went through the stage door together. Her lodging lay in the same direction as his, and he carried her bag for her. The silent roads were slippery, but he couldn't give her his arm because he had his own portmanteau in the other hand. "I suppose you haven't settled for anything else?" she asked as they blundered along. "No." "I haven't either. Isn't it horribly cold?" Her shoulders were hunched under her spring jacket. "I can lend you today's Era if you like. There may be something useful in it." "Thanks, I've seen it," he said. "I've written. I squandered fourpence on stamps this morning. I shan't hear from anybody." "One never does." "Well, there's no need for you to worry. You're sure to be all right one day." "It looks like it, doesn't it?" She had applied as a "strong character actress, tall," and a "smart juvenile lady, petite," and as a "useful lady to complete company," practically as everything except a pathetic child actress accustomed to dying, and a "coloured songstress." Enjoined by the advertisers to "state absolutely lowest," she had stated terms that were abject. Commanded to forward photos and refs, she had sent the most flattering of her photographs, and referred to the most prominent of the managers by whom she was known. Some of the advertisements had added, "Silence, a polite negative." And despite the variety of her endeavours, and the stamps that she had enclosed for the photographs to be returned, it was the only politeness that she had received. "Was it always so difficult?" asked Tatham. "I haven't been in it very long myself, you know." "It has always been just as bad in my time. It was easier before there was so much musical comedy, they say. There aren't so many vacancies as there used to be for people who don't sing and dance. Those who pay the piper call the tune, of course. Audiences have got to have what they want, but the musical comedy tune is a funeral march to a good many of us. I say, I do wish you'd give me that bag back." It was bumping against him provokingly, but he said it wasn't. A belated mill hand clattered by them. After the mill hand passed, the white, vivid distance was unpeopled. Saying a little more, they trudged through the sleeping town till the girl's doorstep was reached. "Thanks awfully," she said, shivering. "I'm not sure whether I shall go by the early train to-morrow or not. If we don't meet at the station, good-bye." "Good-bye." "And good luck." He put the bag down, and their numbed hands were clasped for a moment. "Good luck to you, Miss Lane," he said. Long afterwards, when he had forgotten in what town it had been, he remembered that walk through white, empty streets, and his wishing her luck on a doorstep. End of Chapter 1 of Book 1. Book 1, Chapter 2 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. The drawing room at Regent's Park looked palatial after the bed sitting rooms in which he had been living for the last 3 months, and he was cordially received. Excepting for an explanation that the spare room would shortly be required for one of the married daughters, and that an extra bed had been put for him in his cousin Harold's room instead, an arrangement which, he surmised, must be vastly irksome to his cousin Harold. There was little to remind him that he was in the way. The family questioned him about his doings, and listened smiling to an account of some incidents of the tour. And when his aunt inquired, "Of course, you've no idea yet what you're going to do next?" her tone was so light that he could nearly persuade himself that her heart didn't sink when he said "No." Then, by way of contributing gossip of interest, Mr. Spaulding informed the group that the son of a neighbour had just gone on the stage and exhibited such ability that he'd been engaged at £10 a week for 2 years on end. The hop merchant, astute in his own business, knew it for a fact, for the boy's father had told him. "Wonderful," he exclaimed admiringly to his nephew, "isn't it?" The wonder was that he had credited the lie, but Tatham couldn't say so. He answered that it was wonderful indeed. And Harold, who was a dandy, and was always chaffed for the elaborate care that he took of his clothes, had been so good as to huddle them together disastrously to make space for the guests. Some guests are never hilariously content. In ordinary circumstances, next morning Tatham would have gone to see his mother, but the lady had recently removed to a boarding house at Sweetbay, so he lunched with his aunt. The other men were in the city. "Sweetbay must be much nicer for her than Dalston," he said. "I was very glad to hear she was going. Does she like it, do you know?" "I think she does," said Mrs. Spaulding. "Yes, I think she likes it very much better. She'd been anxious to get away from London for a long time, she told me." "Oh, you've seen her?" He was pleased, for the Spauldings had no great liking for his mother. Their invitations to her were few, and their services perfunctory. "No, I did want to ask her to come and stay with us for a week, but we've had such a houseful all the winter that there was really no opportunity. There have been friends of the boys staying here, and one thing and another. I had a letter from her. She said she didn't want to worry you about it. You were doing all you could. But she wasn't comfortable where she was, and there was a place at Sweetbay that would take her for very little more." "You've sent her money again? That was awfully kind of you." "Oh, well, of course, we couldn't let her want. It doesn't amount to a great deal. One would like to do more than that, but—" She sighed. "Your uncle has so many claims upon him, you've no idea. Of course, it's unfortunate you find the stage such uphill work. If you could get regular engagements it'd be different. You know, I wonder you don't try for a good part at a first-class theatre, Chris. Modesty is all very well, but there's such a thing as being too modest. I think you're a little too slow to move. I don't think you've enough confidence in yourself. If you never look for better things, you'll never get them, you know. You mustn't expect the prizes of your profession to come and look for you." "You don't quite grasp the position," he ventured. "As an unknown man, I might spend years trying for a good part in a first-class theatre without getting so far as a word with the manager. If I didn't accept the kind of thing that's possible, I should never get anything at all." She replied by a reference to an actor who had lately made a successful first appearance in London after 20 years of struggle and privation. "There's a new young man just come out," she said. "We saw him the other night, and he's excellent. I daresay you could have done it just as well. He looks something like you. He's quite a beginner, I'd never heard his name before. You need to aim higher, Chris. You want more pluck. Of course, you've got us, and we shall always be very glad to have you here, when we can put you up, but I should like to see you do better for your own sake. I'm sure you'd be happier if you were more independent." Chicken stuck in his throat. "If Uncle George can still give me a berth, I'm ready to go into the city to-morrow," he said thickly. "Oh, nonsense, there's no occasion to do anything impetuous like that. It really all depends on how whether your prospects improve or not. Of course, if things go better with you, well and good. Of course, we're quite ready to make ourselves responsible for your mother altogether, while you're out of an engagement, just as we've always been. Only you ought to bustle as much as you can, and not let the grass grow under your feet, you know. Because if you do have to give up your profession and turn your mind to other things, it'd be a mistake to begin too late. You're not a boy, Chris, and naturally, you'd have a lot to learn before you could hope to be of much use to your uncle. A little more?" Nor did he want any cheese. and there was no grass growing under his feet that afternoon on the sloppy pavements of the Strand. He was bound for his agent's. He spoke of Mr. Albemarle as his agent because a booking fee had been paid to secure Mr. Albemarle's interest. Mr. Albemarle did not speak of Tatham as his client because he did not remember Tatham's name. A narrow staircase led to a sparsely furnished apartment, of which a conspicuous feature was a vast assortment of faded photographs. There were photographs of sirens being arch in musical comedies, of heroines being distraught in dramas, of heroes propping brows with forefingers and straining violently to look profound. A goodly number of the originals waited in attitudes of despondence on the forms that lined the walls, and at a table in the corner a young woman with dyed hair piled over a cheap and obvious frame was clicking a typewriter. Tatham discovered space to sit down and glanced throughout the room to see if any acquaintance was present. All were strangers to him. From Kennington and Camberwell, from Brixton and East Ham, the theatre folk had journeyed, not a few of them afoot, in the prayer that they might "hear of something." They had put on the least shabby of their clothes, and to Tatham's eyes the women looked less indigent than the men, but their flowered hats and flimsy smartness shrieked their poverty to one another. Many of the crowd had spent a morning of dejection making the round of the agents' offices. When Mr. Albemarle filled them, they would thread their way along the crowded Strand again, with aching feet and empty stomachs and affected jauntiness, hoping to the last. They might meet a "pal who knew of something," or who would, at least, be "good for a glass of bitter." There might be a shady manager collecting a new company in the public houses. Their salaries with him would be uncertain, but even to take a risk would be better than to go back with no news at all. There were wives and children awaiting the return to Kennington and Camberwell. There were lodging-house keepers clamorous for rent. To-day the Strand is wider, but the progress of the players in it just as slow. It was 4 o'clock when Tatham was at last admitted to the agent's presence. The gentleman was occupied at a desk. He had a silk hat on his head and a long cigar in his mouth, each at an angle of 45 degrees. "Well, Mr. he said hurriedly, "I'm afraid I've nothing for you to-day. Things are very quiet just now." Never had Tatham heard him say anything more optimistic since the occasion when the fee was paid, but again a forlorn effort to prolong the scene proved useless. The actor went slowly out. He had not paid a booking fee at any other office, he was not in a position to pay one now. He was not a chorus girl. Some chorus girls were able to secure agents' interest without that formality. Blankly he questioned, as he had questioned on the same spot a score of times, what course was open. He felt weak, futile, and contemptible for being so. Yet what could he do? He remembered how, despairing one night under the portico of a theatre, where an ex-society woman was attracting all London by her beauty, he had drooped in the glare, gazing at her photographs and thinking she must be compassionate. He remembered how he had pencilled on his card an appeal for a minute's interview and sent it in to her, and how he had shrunk from a scene shifter's eyes as the fellow brought him her curt refusal. What could he do? At the foot of a career in which, for all but the moneyed and the influential, the potent factor is chance, he could do nothing but what he did, possessing his soul in patience and in his uncle's house. And every evening his uncle asked, "Well, any news?" So 6 weeks went by. "Well, any news?" He meant it kindly, but his guest came to dread the return from the city and that question. "No, sir." "Humph." The tone conveyed his reflections. One wet afternoon when Tatham, having gone down from Mr. Albemarle's office, loitered in the shelter of the street door, something happened. Nothing sensational. Mr. Albemarle came down too. As the client stood wondering which way to turn next, the agent brushed past him and loitered also, looking to right and left for a cab. "Rotten weather," he said casually to Tatham. "Filthy, isn't it?" said Tatham. "Will you come and have a drink?" Now, in Mr. Albemarle's, the proposal of a drink aroused no such rejoicing as it inspired in many of his humbler clients. He could afford to drink at his own expense, and did so very often, but it happened that at the moment the suggestion fell pleasantly on his ears. All the same, he hesitated. Coming from the lips of an obscure young pro, the invitation was either a strange bit of luck or a piece of infernal cheek. He looked Tatham in the face before he spoke. "I don't mind if I do," he said graciously. So lowly is the path to histrionic fame that the vasty man was conscious of appearing to have improved his position as he entered the bodega with Mr. Albemarle, and indeed a dozen loungers there regarded him curiously. "What'll you have?" he asked. "Mine's the usual," said the personage to the barman. He waved a condescending hand in several directions. "Things are very quiet just now," he remarked, forgetting that he had just delivered his stock phrase in the office. "I find it their normal state. You think you'll be able to find me something next week, do you?" "What?" Obviously he was surprised, but he recovered himself in an instant. "Oh, I daresay. Always drop in when you're passing, that's the best way. Always pleased to see you. If anything turns up, there you are." "I've been dropping in for 18 months. Nothing has turned up so far. My name's Christopher Tatham." "Of course it is," said Mr. Albemarle. "I know your name very well. I can't shop everybody. There aren't enough parts to go round, Latham, old chap. I'd shop the whole blessed profession if I could. What do you think? It'd suit me all right, but you see what it is, there's too many at the game. What's your line?" "I've been playing character. Tatham, not Latham." "I remember now. It had slipped my memory just for the moment." The barman put the glasses on the counter. "Here's fortune." "But what I want to play is lead." "Lead. Right." "Do you think you could manage it for me?" "Do I think I could manage it?" echoed Mr. Albemarle. He looked into Tatham's eyes significantly, and his dramatic pause was so protracted that his stare became embarrassing. "Do I think I could manage it? No, I don't think, Latham, I know." "That's encouraging. Who made Bernard Lee?" The query was darted aggressively. "Who made Eric Latimer? Would Billy Hudson be where he is if it hadn't been for me?" Tatham much feared he had offended him for ever. "What I can't manage ain't worth managing." "I suppose not." "Don't worry." After all, he hadn't been offended. His leer was supremely reassuring. It conveyed a secret compact between himself and Tatham, was charged with esoteric confidences which, though Tatham failed to understand them, promised to flourish master keys among portals to fame. "Leading men with the right appearance ain't difficult to shop." The next instant, with appalling swiftness, he drained his whisky and soda and turned to go. Hope swooned. "Have another?" "What? No, no more. Well, one, for luck." He imbibed the second leisurely, but discoursed without a break on the abominable ingratitude that he had experienced at the hands of theatrical stars who owed their eminence to his services. Suspensive, Tatham waited for a chance to interpose a question. At last, when the other was saying "hell" as a prelude to a further reminiscence, he exclaimed, "You know, I'm awfully keen on getting something at once, Mr. Albemarle. I've got to find another engagement right off. Of course the money's an object. I depend on the profession, but I'm not standing out for terms. Now, how soon do you think you could get me a leading part at, say, well, at any figure at all? Frankly, you can't do it this evening or to-morrow morning, but give me an idea when it might be. That's not asking too much, is it?" Something in the appeal went home to Mr. Albemarle, also the second drink was humanising him. He was temporarily truthful. "Look here," he said familiarly, "you want a shop, don't you? What's the good of kidding about leading business? What you want's a bit every Saturday morning to pay your way, like everybody else, ain't I right?" "Perfectly right," said Tatham, dismayed. "Very well then. You know, and I know, it's not a scrap of use your opening your mouth too wide and calling yourself a leading man. Jump at whatever you can get, that's my advice to you. They're sending out a tour from the Sceptre. Get round there to-morrow 12 sharp, ask for Mr. Bailey, say I sent you. Mind, I can't promise anything'll come of it, you won't be the only one on the spot, but it's a tip. It's a big cast, and they haven't settled for any of the small parts yet." The descent from the prospect seen 5 minutes ago was steep, and the cost of the entertainment alarming, so alarming that Tatham determined to walk to Regent's Park instead of taking a bus. But as he turned down Bedford Street he was not disconsolate. There was at any rate a chance of sorts. End of chapter 2. Book 1, Chapter 3 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. There were 18 parts to be filled for the provincial tour of the play at the Sceptre Theatre, and actors and actresses desirous of filling them were informed that Mr. Bailey was to be found in the business manager's office upstairs. When Tatham, who arrived betimes, explored the quarter indicated, not more than 50 to 60 applicants sat and stood about the landing, awaiting admittance to the room, but their number was continuously reinforced. By 1:30, when Mr. Bailey, having disposed of other matters, proceeded to attack the task before him, the staircase had become impassable, and at the foot groups of men sat morosely on the ground. Behind the enamelled door, visible only to the most fortunate, the eagerly sought interviews seemed, to those interviewed, unpromisingly brief. To those outside they seemed eternal, and as the weary hours lagged by, several girls who could find no space to sit clung weakly to the banisters. It was Tatham's turn at last. One girl's limbs felt as if they must give way. She screwed up the courage. "Oh, do let me go next." "I beg your pardon, certainly." The promptness of the assent amazed her. She turned and regarded him thankfully as he drew back. In that throng of wearied mediocrities fighting for bread in an overstocked profession, a man and a girl's gaze met for the first time, and they smiled at each other. So, although he had no idea who she was, Tatham trusted, while he continued to stand there, that behind the enamelled door the interview was proving satisfactory to her. And when she came out, he glanced at her inquiringly. Did she shake her head? He wasn't sure, but she had made her meaning clear. "I'm sorry," he murmured as she passed. The enamelled door opened again, and an underling appeared on the threshold. He said in a high-pitched voice, "Ladies and gentlemen are not to wait, please. Mr. Bailey can't see any more." Dismay gripped Tatham's heart. Curtsy may cost a theatrical engagement, which is one of the reasons why there is no superabundance of it in the theatrical world. A murmur of consternation swelled over the landing. From the landing to the lowest step it travelled, and was echoed in the hall. As the girl started to go down, the packed rows of applicants broke into disorder, and the view on the staircase was a jumble of dejected backs. She lingered an instant for Tatham to be beside her. "I hope you haven't lost anything by giving me your turn." "Oh, I don't suppose so. I daresay all the men's parts were settled before you went in." It was possible, however, that none was settled, that Mr. Bailey intended to make a selection later among the men who had had the luck to be seen. "It was awfully kind of you." "It was nothing." She was very young, perhaps no more than 17, but she had been bred in a calling in which few girls remain bashful long. The tone in which she spoke to him was the frank, familiar tone of a young woman at once unacquainted with reserve and well accustomed to take care of herself. The gaze she raised to him, from a face which had pink and white youthfulness for its chief charm, was steadily unembarrassed. When she represented a girl of her own years on the stage, of course, she comported herself with more juvenility than any girl of 17 that ever lived, for it is a theatrical convention that girls of 17 caper about a drawing room as if they were 7. But she crossed a room without capering in real life. He was good looking and his depression was manifest. She spoke again. I'm most awfully grateful to you, really. I felt as if I couldn't stand it another second, or I wouldn't have had the cheek to ask you." "It wasn't any use though, eh?" "I don't think so. He took my name, but I don't fancy it'll come off. Have you been out long?" "About 6 weeks." "Oh, that's not so bad," she said. "I've been doing nothing for months. What were you with last?" He told her the title of the melodrama in which he had toured last, and wondered if he could add "Good morning" without being abrupt, for he was in no humour for small talk with a stranger. But evidently her fatigue was not mental. She continued to question him, and their passage to the street was of necessity slow. On the pavement they came to a standstill together. "What shall you try for now?" she inquired. "I've no idea. Have you heard of anything else?" "No. I must have a look at the ads in to day's floats. I haven't seen it yet." His distaste for her companionship was passing, even it had already passed. He foresaw that he would feel very lonely in another minute, as he moved aimlessly along. The girl's interest in his prospects was not unwelcome. "I haven't seen it either," he said. "There's a newsagent's round the corner. Let's go and get a copy." And then the girl did a happy thing. She exclaimed, "Come on," and laughed. Precisely at what she laughed she didn't know, but on a sudden his spirits rose, and he liked her. His spirits dropped when snow began to fall, for the purchase of floats had left him with 5 pence for his capital, and he could not take her into a confectioner's. They sought employment, studying the advertisement columns together, in the sheltered quietude of a mews. Because he was an impecunious gentleman he was humiliated at having to shelter her there. Because she was a little mummer in the rank and file of the profession, she was admiringly surprised by his humiliation. "I think it was very generous of you to buy the paper," she said. "You might have seen it in a bar and had a drink for the money. What's there funny about it? Go on now, find something useful, do. This won't buy the baby a frock." "Well, here's something," he announced. "Wanted, to rehearse next week, full company, with exceptions. To reliable artistes, very long tour assured. What do you say to that?" "It's the best of them yet. Let me look. Where's one to write? Oh, call. Where is it? 20 Thackeray Gardens, Clapham Junction, 3 to 6. Thackeray was an author, that's where they got that name from. What time is it now?" He glanced at his watch. "Nearly 5. I say, you must be starving." "No, I'm not. I took a sandwich with me. I knew what it'd be. Oh, well, it's no good my going to Clapham." "Why?" "I couldn't get there soon enough." "It won't take you any longer to get there than it takes me." "I haven't enough money in my purse. I should have to go home first and borrow it from mother. It's too far. We're in diggings at Notting Hill." They considered ruefully. A brougham swung round the mews and started them backwards into a puddle. "5 pence won't do it, I suppose," said Tatham, looking at his boot. "I don't know, I forget. Anyhow, it'll be a tin pot sort of show. I'm not sure that it's good enough." "Any show for me," he said. "I'll tell you what." "Well, you can go, of course. 5 pence'll be enough for one." "I'll tell you what. Let's hurry up and find a pawnbroker's, and I'll pop my watch." "As if I'd let you, just to pay my fare." "Well, why shouldn't I?" "That isn't likely. Popping your watch for me?" "I should have to pop it for myself to morrow. Come on, there's a good girl, don't waste time. Look here, if you don't go, I shan't go either. That's a fact. I mean it." He stood looking in her eyes until she smiled. Her smile lit her face very prettily. "You are a nice boy," she said. She did indeed think him very nice, and when they had found a pawnshop and she waited for him outside, the pleasing fancy crossed her mind that it was almost as if they were married. "How much did they lend you on it?" she asked when he came back. A new authority was in her tone. 35 shillings. "My! It must have been a fine watch." "Don't speak of it in the past. I hope to see it again," he said. "Which is our way? We go from Victoria, don't we? We'd better take a bus from Charing Cross." "You haven't told me your name." "Christopher Tatham. What's yours?" Peggy Harper. I knew a Chris once. He was a ventriloquist," she observed. "This is my card." The card told him no more than the name that she had already communicated. The passion of ladies in the lower ranks of his profession for distributing their printed cards at every opportunity surprised him again after she had paused among the crowd, to rummage in a pocket that took a long time to discover. The presence of the other passengers did not constrain her on the journey, and he found it agreeable enough, far pleasanter than if he had been alone. It was not unamusing to wander among mean streets, inquiring for Thackeray Gardens with a happy-go-lucky girl who said, "I daresay we shall have come out here for nothing after all," and laughed, as if coming to Clapham for nothing would be a capital joke. It was fun to wait with her in the unprepossessing parlour of a lodging house, and hear her whisper, with a peremptory nod as the door knob turned, "You speak first." The advertiser, who, it transpired, called himself Armytage, was evidently attired for the occasion. He wore a frock coat, in combination with a summer waistcoat, much crumpled, and the trousers of a tweed suit. A garnet pin ornamented the wrong portion of a made-up tie. Early in the interview he confessed, with a lugubrious shake of the head, that long as he had been in management, he had not realised until this afternoon what a multitude of actors and actresses were out of work. The overture sounded unpromising, but it appeared by the light of his later remarks that vacancies might possibly remain in the company for just such artistes as Tatham and Miss Harper. His intention was to open in 3 weeks' time at Sweetbay, he informed them, and "the money, though small, was sure." Figures revealed it to be small indeed. On taking a note of their references and addresses, he was plainly impressed by a terrace in Regent's Park, and regarded Tatham with new interest. "I suppose you could dress the part," he said. "Got a classy modern wardrobe?" "I've got clothes, yes," said Tatham. He hoped with increased force that the part was a good one, since his mother would see him in it. "Dress well on and off, I make it a rule. It pays for actors to look like gentlemen. And what about you, my dear? Frock's all right?" "Oh, I should do you credit," said the girl flippantly. Tatham envied her professional self-possession. Mr. Armytage repeated that they might hear from him in 2 or 3 days, and the artistes left the villa thoughtfully. "He sounds like a humbug," said Tatham, "doesn't he?" "He doesn't sound up to much," she assented. "It'll be a rotten show, of course. Frocks? I'd fake up any old rag and be good enough for his crowd. But the money may be safe with him. You can't go by manner. The bogus people often sound the best. I shan't take it if anything else comes along in the meantime, but he may be all right. He's one of the old school, never been to school, but I was in panto with a manager who might have been his twin brother, and we got paid every Saturday morning as right as rain. Goodness, a lot of the men who leave you stranded might be Johnnies from Oxford and Cambridge, by their clothes and the way they talk. Education don't make people straight. Some of the biggest bounders in the profession used to be swells before they went on the stage. I expect you'll change. The profession changes everybody." "Thank you," he said. "Well, you will. It's sure to spoil you. You won't keep like you are now, you can't." "Why not?" "Because they never do." "But why not?" She reflected. "Well, if fellows behave like cads anywhere else, they get cold-shouldered, you see, and in the profession they don't. I suppose it tempts them to be crooked when they know they won't be thought any the worse of for it. I say, this isn't the way to the station. Where are you going?" "We're going to have something to eat," said Tatham. "Do you think it's too soon?" Her eyes widened at him, almost pathetically, and then she broke into a laugh again. There was a note of hysteria in the laugh this time. "When I'm a star, I'll find out where you are and get you a swagger engagement." "I wonder." "Look here." Her voice was sharp, and she stopped short under a gas lamp. "I never forget a pal." "I was only joking." "Well, I wasn't. You've been a brick. I'd do things for you if I ever got the chance. But I never shall, not at this business anyhow." "Don't you think you'll ever be a star then?" "What, me?" "Why shouldn't you?" "I'd give up the stage to morrow if I'd got anything else to do. I'd never have gone on it if I'd had my way. What did you take to it for?" "I love it." "You don't! Oh, I do, really. Well, I'm astonished," she said. "I should have thought you were ever so much too clever for that. Whatever do you love about it? I think it's a rotten business." "It's a rotten business as one is now, but if one gets on, it may be a great art." The word "art" evidently conveyed little to her mind. Her voice was puzzled. "I don't see anything in it. Of course, I'd like big money, but I'd much rather get it without having to act. I think acting's silly. I don't see how you can be expected to laugh and cry and carry on a part just as if it was all real." "You have to feel as if it were all real while you're studying the lines. You have to ask yourself just how you would say it all if it were something happening in your own life." "Oh, my word!" she exclaimed protestingly. Her attention wandered. "The shops about here don't come up to the West End ones, do they? They're much better than this about Notting Hill." They had dinner in a shabby little Italian place, half restaurant, half cake shop, where they were the only customers. Soup and a fillet, both very indifferent, with stale chocolate eclairs to follow, seemed to her epicurean, and she pronounced the fried potatoes a long way better than what you got with pen'orths of fried fish. The gratification of her appetite, even more, the novelty of being entertained, exhilarated her exceedingly, and she had felt a pleasurable sense of unfamiliar dignity in seeing a bottle of beer opened for her by a shuffling waiter. It was past 8 when Tatham wished her good night, after lending her the coppers to take her home. The lateness of his return to Regent's Park had raised expectations, and he was greeted with a chorus of "Well?" A detailed account of the day's doings, he thought, was likely to be ill received, and he dwelt much more upon his interview at Clapham than upon his disappointment at the Sceptre. He could not, however, avoid creating the impression that he had presented himself at the theatre tardily, and more than ever he was conscious that patience with his career was moribund. This time next month, would he be an actor or a clerk? Instinct proclaimed that his fate was in the unwashed hands of Mr. Armytage. End of chapter 3. Book 1, Chapter 4 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. One of the drawing-room windows permitted the anxious to view an exasperating postman for nearly 5 minutes before he reached number 12. During the next 4 days Tatham spent much of his time at that window. In a letter to his mother he had mentioned that there was a prospect of his going to Sweetbay, and the widow had already replied, supposing that by now the engagement was settled. Experience had supplied no grounds for her supposition, but her optimism, or the carelessness with which she had read his letter, would make it additionally distasteful to him to have to say he could not go. And the postman had a letter for every house in the terrace excepting number 12. Then, when Tatham wasn't watching, and hadn't heard any knock at the street door, the parlour maid unconcernedly handed a bulky envelope to him. A part was inside. He was engaged. He had never seen the play, had no idea whether the part was good, was for the present too much excited to do more than whip over the pages to ascertain whether it was long or short, but thanksgiving throbbed in him. He was engaged. "It's come," he announced rapturously to his aunt. And to-day he looked forward to his Uncle George's return from the City and the question, "Any news?" Was Miss Peggy Harper engaged too? He wondered. In an unfurnished room over a public house, where the rehearsals were conducted, it became evident to him that she was not. Among the dreary-faced women and disreputable-looking men who mumbled and moved about the room under Mr. Armytage's direction, no Miss Harper appeared. Tatham regretted her absence, for in the environment in which he found himself, the arrival of almost any acquaintance would have been welcome. With a single exception, he saw that the artistes around him represented the lowest grade of the theatrical world, and there recurred to him distressingly that sense of shame which had been one of his earliest experiences in his profession. The exception referred to was a smartly dressed youth of about 19 who, by his clothes and unfamiliarity with stage business, excited many humorous winks among the other men. He was, plainly, embarrassed and unhappy, and since the premium demanded of him had been paid and the cheque swiftly cashed, the manager was at no pains to afford encouragement. "Now then, you," he bawled, "don't you know there's supposed to be a window there? Are you going to walk through a third-floor window at night? We want actors, not acrobats. Hey, Lonsdale!" The youth, with the cooperation of his sisters, had selected the name of Vernon Lonsdale. He had grown his hair long, and they had pictured him in romantic situations, looking like Curl Bellew. Just now he looked like sacrificing his premium. "I beg your pardon," he stammered. "I didn't know where the window was meant to be." He hurriedly advanced and stood with pale cheeks awaiting his next cue. A melancholy female read indistinctly from her part some lines that concluded with the word menace. She pronounced it to rhyme with grimace, and the youth, not recognising her intention, remained mute. "Go on, my boy," roared Armytage. "Why the hell don't you go on?" "I haven't had my cue," said the youth resentfully. "Show me your part," commanded Armytage. "There you are, it's in your part right enough. Menace." "Oh, menace," said the youth. "What's that? What d'you call it, my boy? Menace? Rats! That's extant. That's altogether extant." He evidently relished his discovery of extant, which he seemed to believe was a scholarly synonym for out of date. He looked round for Tatham. "Isn't menace extant, eh?" he inquired. "Quite," said Tatham. His gaze met the discomfited youth's with a twinkle. "Of course it is," said the manager. "And even if it wasn't, menace is more dramatic. Go on, young fellow my lad, we can't spend the day here teaching you the ABC, you know." Tatham, recognising the school into which he had fallen, sat resolved to declaim his lines in the most melodramatic fashion of which he was capable when his turn came, but even so, it was not at the outset unnatural enough. Intense dejection weighed upon him as he laid intelligence upon the altar of expediency. The art of acting itself tottered on the pedestal of his enthusiasm, and miserably he questioned whether his dignity was any higher than a performer who stuffed flaming tow into his mouth in a road. Pity for young Lonsdale depressed him too, as from day to day he beheld the youth jeered at and bullied. He was not a brilliant youth. It was difficult to credit him with enough capacity to make his way in any walk of life, but his numerous suits of clothes suggested that he might have squandered as much as £50 to secure a professional début on the stage, and the sum at least entitled him to civility. "It's very different to what I thought it was going to be," he complained to Tatham in a girlish voice. "He was awfully polite when I saw him at Clapham, and he said it was a good part. I don't call it a good part, do you? There's only that little pathetic bit in the third act that I take any interest in." "There isn't a good part in the piece," answered Tatham. "Oh, don't you think so? I think some of them are all right, only the people are so common, they're an awfully low lot, aren't they? No, I don't call it at all a good part now, excepting for that little pathetic bit in the third act. It looked all right when I read it at home, but it seems so different at rehearsal. I'm always being bundled about. When I do come to a speech, somebody cuts in before I've got the last word out. Don't you know what I mean?" "Yes, I know very well. He cuts in to prevent you getting any applause. That's the reason for that." "Oh, I say! But that's awfully mean, isn't it? I didn't think actors did that sort of thing. I wonder it's allowed." "It isn't allowed by people who are in a position to stand up for their rights. Beginners have got to grin and bear it if the manager doesn't interfere." "Oh, I shouldn't like to complain. They'd be so rude, wouldn't they?" "Yes, they'd be very rude," said Tatham. "I'm not complaining either. What does it matter anyhow in a thing like this? The person who hasn't shaved for a week is going to spoil my best scene for me. He thinks I don't know enough to understand that he's trying to spoil it, but I do." "I never hear him cut you short," said Lonsdale enviously. "No, he can't break in very often, but he keeps getting further behind me at every rehearsal. In the theatre I shall have to turn my back to the audience all the time I talk to him, and that'll make him look the chief figure in the scene, although he isn't meant to be." "Will it really? Why should it? He must be an awfully vain brute, mustn't he? Well, one thing," he laughed gleefully, "that beast of a comedian can't try the same dodge on me, with my little pathetic bit in the third act, for he's got to be sitting down, writing a letter, while I say it." The journey to Sweetbay was made on a Sunday morning. The heterogeneous garments that they donned for travelling gave to the company an appearance even more repellent than they presented in the public house. The train reached the prim little watering place at the hour when many of the residents passed the station on their return from church, and as the players, burdened with strange hand luggage, straggled into their midst, Tatham heard young Lonsdale panting behind him. "I say!" exclaimed the boy. His face was aghast. "This is awful, isn't it? Why on earth don't they have any cabs here?" Tatham was execrating it too. "I suppose nobody arrives in the place on Sunday excepting us. But I can't afford cabs myself. Where are you going to stay? Have you arranged anywhere?" Like Tatham, the tyro had still to discover apartments, and it appeared that he meant to seek them on the parade. Tatham reflected. It did not concern him, but the lad seemed pathetic in his ignorance. "Look here," he said, "I don't want to meddle, but I'm afraid you'll find it very expensive if you hang out in first-class diggings on a tour like this. I don't mean just the rent. I'm afraid you'll find it comes very dear in other ways. You'll be a mark for all the men in the crowd to borrow money from. I expect they'll be cadging from you anyhow. Prossing, they call it. But if they hear of your lolling on balconies on parades, you'll be preyed upon frightfully. They'll ask you for half sovereigns." "I say," said Lonsdale. He put two and two together. "You think they guess it's my first engagement?" "Yes, I think they divine it," said Tatham. "If you take my advice, you'll stay in the same sort of lodgings as everybody else. You needn't have a bedroom and parlour combined, of course, but I should keep to the professional addresses, if I were you." "Thanks," said the boy. "I'm much obliged to you. It's awfully decent of you to give me the tip." He sighed. "It is different to what I thought it'd be. And the girls! I always thought actresses were pretty. Why, I never saw such a crew in my life." At this moment, among the returning congregation, an elderly lady approached, in her Sunday costume, her eyebrows protesting against the troop of vulgar travellers that profaned the pavements. Tatham saw, confused, that the lady was his mother. She recognised her son almost at the same instant, and with pretended pleasure, which ill-concealed dismay, stopped short to welcome him. "Why, Chris!" she faltered. Lonsdale proceeded alone, in the wake of the heavy man and the low comedian, and a perturbed glance followed them. "Do these people belong to your company?" "The young one's right enough," declared Tatham, momentarily vain of Lonsdale. "Well, how are you, mother?" "Oh, I'm first rate. Couldn't you have left your portmanteau at the station? One never sees anybody carrying luggage about on Sunday in Sweetbay." "Well, you see, a lot of the things that are in it I shall want to-night. Of course, the arrival isn't pleasant, it never is. We don't always get in at church time, though, thank goodness. Well, tell me, is the boarding house still all right? I was going to see you this afternoon." "Yes, do. Oh yes, there are one or two very smart people there. Let's move round the corner, Chris, we look so bad standing here. Yes, we've quite nice people. An army man and his wife, you'll see them when you come. We play bridge in the evening. Don't say what you're doing here. I shouldn't like them to know you're on the stage. I lost 14 and sixpence the other week. Nearly broke me." She tittered, as at an incident of a humorous nature. "Had to write to the Spauldings." A titter announced this to be funnier still. "Said I wanted new boots. They sent me a sovereign. I was saved." The mirthfulness of the recital overwhelmed her. He perceived with mixed emotions that her removal had invigorated his mother, mentally at least. The humiliated pensioner that he remembered in Dalston had become accustomed to dependence, and even callous to it. "Perhaps somebody'll see my name on the playbills," he warned her. "Oh, I don't think so. We don't take much notice of the theatre here. Only rubbish comes down. Anyhow, I shan't say anything about it unless they ask me. Well, I mustn't wait. We have luncheon at 1 o'clock. We've luncheon on Sundays too. We dine late on Sundays, just the same as any other day there. It's not at all like an ordinary boarding house. They don't take everybody. Mrs. Harrington's very particular who she takes. Then you'll be round about 4:30? Make yourself look as nice as you can. Put on the best suit you've got, Chris. I hope none of them will see you carrying your portmanteau. Wasn't there a cab in the yard? I wonder you don't jump into a cab for a shilling. A shilling. It had often been a strain on his finances to buy a penny postage stamp for the letter that contained his remittance to her. He continued his way thoughtfully. The current issue of Floats, seen in London, had informed him in which streets the few theatrical apartment houses of Sweetbay were situated, and when he had found a combined room, he was provided with a cut from the landlady's joint. Well, after what his mother had said, it was to be presumed that she would not go to see his performance. He would be much relieved if she didn't, yet he was hurt that she did not wish to do so. As he smoked a pipe, he was conscious that the eagerness with which he had anticipated his visit to her had subsided, and, when at 4:30 he paid it, he found himself increasingly dull. It served, however, to confirm his conjecture that the lady's presence at the theatre was not to be feared. She explained that a matinée always gave her a headache, and that, of course, she couldn't sit in a theatre alone at night. Besides, her going would be sure to cause a lot of talk about the piece, and somebody might have the curiosity to look at the cast. She thought it was much safer for her to keep away. "Oh, and, Chris," she said, before the alleged army man and his nondescript wife appeared to make painful persiflage over pale tea, "don't say you're stopping here. Say you're going back to town this evening. See? If Mrs. Harrington heard you were here for a week, she'd want to know where you were staying, and I shouldn't like her to know you were doing it on the cheap." He was struggling for advancement on a squalid plane of an unpromising vocation, and perhaps was a fool to have chosen it, but very often he had struggled unfed that his mother might receive the expected pound intact, and he winced to know she was ashamed of him. Next night he was ashamed of himself. He rejoiced that she had not come to witness his ignominy among these barnstormers. Again they made him marvel. They blasphemed, in the wings, at the coldness of the public, they cursed the limitations of the stage, they anathematized the blunders of the limelight man, but that they were figuring in a preposterous play, in a manner that was devoid of talent or intelligence or a single virtue, they were blankly and complacently unaware. Only young Lonsdale had adverse criticism to utter upon a performance. Tatham was alone with him for a few minutes when the other men had hurried to the bars. "I say," wailed the débutante, tears stood in his eyes, "my little pathetic bit in the third act, I don't see how I'm ever going to make a name like this. That beast of a low comedian, he drank out of the ink pot instead of the glass, he carried on like a clown while I was speaking. That little pathetic bit of mine in the third act was the only time the audience laughed." But when Saturday came, after 5 unprofitable nights, the greenhorn of the company was the member least disturbed. Grouped on the stage of the Theatre Royal, Sweetbay, the barnstormers waited for Mr. Armytage to appear with their salaries. The gentleman was due at noon. At 1:15 they stood waiting still, and comments had ceased. When the hour struck, the faces of the crowd were blanched. Everybody looked much older. Upon the matinée announced to commence at 2:30, the curtain did not rise. Few local playgoers were disappointed. Then it was common knowledge that Mr. Armytage had been observed departing from Sweetbay by a very early train among the milk churns. When he advertised for his next band of victims, his name would not be Armytage. Yes, the greenhorn was the member of the company least disturbed, for though he had lost his premium, he had lost his eagerness, at any rate to be associated with a troupe like this one, and he, alone among the artistes, was unharassed by the problem of ways and means. Tatham was stunned by it. from his mother, who had visited him surreptitiously, perturbed lest Mrs. Harrington and the army man should "ever wonder what she was doing down this end of the town." Assistance was impossible. His only course was to beg a loan of Lonsdale or to write to the Spauldings. The remembrance of his warning to Lonsdale, as much as the doubt how the sum would be repayable, nerved him to appeal to his aunt. He lacked the amount of his bill and his fare to London, and a postal order duly reached him. But when he had slunk back to No. 12, where the extra bed had been restored to his cousin Harold's room, Uncle George's proclamation on the hearthrug after dinner caused him no astonishment. "You must see for yourself that this won't work, my boy," said Spaulding definitely. "You'll have to give the stage up. You must try to take an interest in something else. You'll have to be satisfied with a berth. I'll do what I can for you, and you'll be able to manage better if you and your mother go into lodgings together. There's no reason for her to remain at Sweetbay. You can take 3 rooms together somewhere in a cheap neighbourhood, and you'll both of you be much more comfortable that way. You'd better come into the city with me to-morrow morning." End of chapter 4. Book 1, Chapter 5 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. When the dull confusion had cleared from his mind, when the place where he sat had begun to be a familiar place, and he knew, without raising his eyes, that 5 letter files fell awry to the left of the mantelpiece, and just what section of a wall and a water pipe was visible across the glossy red backs of the 3 bulky account books that flanked the copying press, Tatham was surprised to perceive that the intimidating clerks under the green shades around him were becoming no less human than actors. Like the actors that he had deserted, they performed their duties without zest and without expectation. The dream in which some of them had once indulged of being summoned to the chief's presence to receive compliments and a prominent position already looked as fantastic to their minds as the dream of playing Hamlet before royalty looked to the disillusioned actor evading his washerwoman in Bacup. Just as all the interests of the actors had lain outside the theatre, so all the interests of the clerks lay outside the office. Admitting him by degrees to confidences, somewhat tardily, because he was the boss's nephew, the erstwhile intimidating businessman talked of music halls. Eventually they were more confidential than he, for when their conversation turned upon the play he did not, since it would have rendered the sense of failure still more poignant to him, acknowledge that he had been on the stage. He listened to their criticisms pensively, and accepted their mistakes without remonstrance. Not even the strange assertions of the accountant, a confirmed playgoer, who by reason of his age erred dogmatically, provoked him to correction. The proposal that she should return to London had not appealed to Mrs. Tatham. She had been forced to submit herself to second-class London lodgings during the last 2 or 3 years of her husband's life, and she shrank from renewing the experience. Her reply that ill health made the plan very undesirable, of course disposed of the suggestion. Her son was installed in a top bedroom in Doughty Street, and lived alone on the half of a larger salary than his clerical capacities would have gained for him from any stranger. By dint of an indefatigable quest for the cheapest city chop-houses, and an avoidance of pudding, he sometimes had a half-crown remaining for the pit of a theatre on Saturday night. Not often. But there were galleries at a shilling. And his most frequent weakness cost him, in cash, nothing at all. He went in the evening to walk in the Strand. Formerly he had loathed the Strand, had paced it despairingly and felt that never, so long as he lived, would he be able even to drive through it without resentment. Yet now the street of memories was not without a tender grace, not without a sentimental appeal. Once or twice, craving to see it again in its most intimate aspect, he lunched rapidly on a sandwich and contrived a breathless visit to the Strand during the luncheon hour. Luck was against him. Though he saw many actors, he saw none whom he knew. But it was an emotional promenade, notwithstanding, that saunter from the Gaiety where he jumped off the bus to Charing Cross Post Office where he turned back wide-eyed. He re-entered clerkdom guiltily, a man with a secret, a clerk who led a double life. When 6 months had worn away, his gloom held but a single gleam of comfort, the reflection that, distasteful as he found the work, he had never scamped it, never reached his place late nor left it too soon, the comfort of reflecting that his uncle must report upon him warmly. Recognizing the salary to be generous though inadequate, he was proud to have deserved the satisfaction. What his uncle actually reported was that "Christopher did just what he was set to do, but had no initiative, and would never be worth more than he was getting." Nearly a year had passed when Tatham at last happened to meet someone associated with the "dear dead days beyond recall," and then it was not in the Strand, and it was not anyone whom he had known well. On a Saturday afternoon, in Long Acre, he saw Miss Peggy Harper approaching. "Hello, hello, hello," she said, stopping to greet him. For the moment she couldn't recall his name, but she put out her hand genially enough, and they stood smiling at each other. "How do you do?" said Tatham constrainedly. To speak to a girl was such an unusual experience now that he felt shy. "And what have you been doing with yourself?" "Oh, I'm all right," he said. "You know that tour came to grief? 1 week and nobody got his money." "What tour?" she said vaguely. Oh, yes, I remember. Well, what's the best news? Are you doing anything?" I've given it up. I'm not on the stage any more." "Aren't you? Well, good judge too. You can't tell me of anything then? I thought perhaps you might have told me of a nice vacancy." She laughed. "I wish I could. Have you been out of an engagement long?" "No, I'm only just back from tour. I'm all on my own now. Mother's playing in Australia. I'm in diggings with another girl. I say, have you seen Ada's No Chicken?" He shook his head. "I don't go to the theatre very often. I can't get seats for nothing now I've left the profession." "What rot! Who's to know you've left it? You could write and enclose one of your old cards." "Oh, I can't do that," he said. "Well, I've got a couple of stalls in my pocket for the matinee this afternoon. The girl I'm living with has got an appointment and can't go with me. If you've nothing to do, you might come." "Oh, thanks, I'd like it immensely," said Tatham. "What time does it begin?" "I'm going there now. Come along then, or we shall be late." He wished he had put on his other coat, but it was delightful, nevertheless, to sit in a stall again and talk to an actress. Almost he forgot in moments that he was to day a clerk. And although his sixpenny programme and the tea when they came out were items of importance, a florin wasn't much as the price of a trip to another planet. She gave him her address before they parted, and with alacrity he accepted her invitation to "come in and see them one of these days." All the week he found himself looking forward to the visit. The fear that on Saturday she was likely to be at another matinee determined him to wait till Sunday, and he rose on Sunday with an eagerness ludicrously disproportionate to the occasion. A new zest was in his mood, a new interest coloured his outlook, a zest and an interest which the girl would have been incapable of inspiring in him 12 months before, when the realm that she represented had been his own realm too. She was lodging over a little shop that described itself as "Dairy and Refreshment Rooms" in Great Queen Street. The shutters were up this afternoon, and he saw no private door. But after he had rung twice, the shop door was opened, and he was instructed to "come through, please." "Second floor," said the woman. "Will you go up?" A glimpse he had of milk cans and of stale cakes under glass covers. He mounted a narrow staircase, to knock timidly. "Come in. Oh, it's you!" Pleasure was in her voice. The tiny room was lit only by firelight. When she had exclaimed that she was "jolly glad he had remembered," and that he was to take his overcoat off and put it down anywhere, he sat by the fire, opposite her, and thought how much cosier it was than his top bedroom. "Naomi will be down in a minute," she said. "She's changing her frock. As soon as she comes you shall have some tea." "Is Naomi the girl you're living with?" "Yes, of course it is. Did you think it was a servant? Naomi Knight. She talks like you ought to get on." "Talks like me?" "I mean, She's awfully serious about it all." "Oh, as I used to talk." "Oh yes, of course. I forgot you weren't in the profession now. What are you doing then?" "I told you. I'm in the City." "Did you? I don't remember," she said. "Do you mean you're in a clerkship? I say, it must be rather a change, isn't it?" Acutely he was conscious that the moment would be beautiful if she were indeed interested to hear what a change it was, if he could make confidences to an actress in the firelight and find her sympathetic. But Peggy Harper chattered on before he could make any answer at all. "What do you think of our rooms? Rotten, aren't they? But we're so close to everything. Look at the time it saves. Where are you living?" Again she omitted to wait for his reply. "When mother settled the Australian engagement, I made up my mind to live near the Strand. No more suburbs for me. I'd rather have the pokiest little place about here than the best diggings in Notting Hill or Brixton that ever were. Half your days spent in going backwards and forwards. And look at the fares, how they mount up. I think this is a jolly good pitch. Of course, our food wants watching, but so it does wherever you go. Does your landlady take your things? Everybody says the professional landladies steal less than the others. Have you found that? Does your landlady let to the profession? I say, it's a funny thing. If anyone steals a ha'porth of bread from a shop once in her life because she's starving, she gets sent to prison, but nearly every landlady steals bread and meat and groceries all the year round as a matter of course, and you mustn't even complain of it openly, or she blackguards you, besides." It was something of a disappointment to find that Miss Naomi Knight was neither very young nor very good looking. She was revealed as a thin, dark woman who seemed at first to possess no other attraction than a pleasant voice. It was not until he had helped to take the cups and saucers from the cupboard, and to clear a good deal of litter from the only table, that she uttered anything but trivialities. Then, of course, the talk reverted from the teapot to the stage, and she told him what character she had played last and what she thought of it. He found her ideas on the subject, for he knew the piece, very interesting. "I said you two'd get on," cried Peggy. "I shock her frightfully. I don't know how she puts up with me." "Don't be so silly," said Miss Knight. "She won't work, Mr. Tatham, that's what's the matter with this girl." "I'm not going to give myself the hump over Shakespeare and Ibsen and things like that. What's the good? I shall never play 'em. Besides, I don't understand what they mean." Miss Knight smiled indulgently. "Some women who do play them don't read them," she said. "I was in a company with a woman once who told me she had played in 3 Shakespearean seasons, and never read one of the plays in her life. She'd only read her own lines." "Do you believe it?" asked Tatham. "Yes," she said, "I quite believe it. I'm sure it was true. The most extraordinary people go on the stage. They haven't any gift for it, and they aren't even earnest about it. I can't make out how they expect to do any good." "Hark at her rubbing it into me," laughed Peggy. "I wasn't thinking about you at all. You're only a child yet." "Child yourself! I shall get up and smack you if you aren't careful. Child indeed!" She appealed gaily to Tatham. "Don't you think I'm grown up?" "I think you're very nice," he said diffidently. "There you are! So I am. So are you. I say, do you know this boy lost his shop through me 100 years ago? That was how we met. 'Do let me go in next,' I said. Like that, the pathetic heroine. 'With pleasure,' he said. Talk about manners, he was a regular Lord Burleigh." "Chesterfield's the gentleman you're thinking of, ducky." "Oh, well, what's the odds? It's all the same. And then he popped his watch for me. I say, did you ever get it out? Let's see if you've got your watch on." He had got it on at last, but he turned very red, and Miss Knight interposed hastily. "Don't take any notice of her. She wants a good shaking. Where were you both? In London? Are you playing anywhere now?" "I've given it up," he said again. "I'm not an actor." "Oh, really? Didn't you care for it?" "Yes, very much." "But that's awfully hard lines on you." She was attentive, grieved. Her attitude invited him to say more. "It was rather a facer. I'm in a clerkship. I had to do something, and engagements were too difficult to find." "But that's cruel." Isn't it beastly rough on him?" exclaimed Peggy brightly, who hadn't thought so till she was told. "And I'm sure he was clever. Weren't you?" "I wasn't clever enough to get on." "Oh, but you're so young," said Miss Knight. "I think it's dreadfully hard lines on you. I do really. And do you have to go to the City every day?" She seemed to hope that he had found a clerkship in which he was needed only once a week. "Saturday's a half holiday, Sunday's a red letter day. This Sunday. I haven't even come across anyone in the profession till I met Miss Harper." "I do think this poor boy is to be pitied," declared Peggy. Her sympathy, though late, was pleasant. "Don't you think it's very brave of him, Naomi?" She went a step too far and made him feel ridiculous. "Won't you tell me more about yourself, Miss Knight? What are you reading now?" She was reading a novel, and a good one, sufficiently good for him to be surprised to learn that she had heard of it. She talked of it very intelligently. It was easy to see that the study of character fascinated her; her interest in it was not a pose, and Tatham began to feel that although she had made no position in the theatre yet, he was listening to a woman who was destined to be heard of by and by. Excepting Elsie Lane, he had known no other actress who impressed him with this conviction, and he could not help reflecting that Peggy Harper was right in saying that they were very dissimilar companions. Yet, because Peggy was young and might in moments be called pretty, it was Peggy who lent enchantment to the parlour over the dairy and refreshment rooms on Sundays now. If Miss Knight sometimes said things that came back to him when he had gone, it was Peggy who drew his gaze oftener when he was there. And her chatter had a charm for him too, for was it not always professional? Indeed, it took him much nearer to the wings than Miss Knight's analyses of Shakespeare's heroines. The chance of getting "shopped" in some obscure company, Naomi's prospect of settling for a part through Albemarle, the disappointments met with, these topics exercised a fascination over a young man, who, stage struck from his boyhood, had been compelled to relinquish the stage. Even the slang that she used made the past glow again. If she had been a dressmaker's assistant or a waitress, her interest would have been slight. But the theatre transmuted her. To him she represented the theatre. He hated the City, and she was the ray of limelight in his life. "Don't you think he's mashed on you, Peggy?" said Miss Knight one day when they sat talking about him. "What rot!" said Peggy, with a conscious smile. "You hum! You know very well he is." "Well, what of it, anyhow?" "Oh, nothing." And that was the girl's view too. He was mashed on her. It meant to her simply the gratification of having made a conquest. Whether he would tell her that he was mashed, even whether she liked him enough to wish him to do so, were matters to which she gave no thought. Why should she? Why worry to think, since he was too hard up to marry for ever so long? Sufficient for the day was the admiration thereof, and it was the first time that she had found an admirer who was a gentleman. That he was a gentleman was as forcefully Tatham's attraction to the girl as the fact of her being an actress was her attraction to him. Just as the man knew, when he was willing to remember it, that she was vapid and vulgar, so the girl knew at the back of her little hen's brain that his conversation was much less congenial to her than the banter of the young men with whom she was accustomed to joke. But he was a gentleman. She had no doubt on the point. She had not needed Naomi's confirmation. Unerringly she could distinguish, as girls on even a lower social stratum can unerringly distinguish, between gentlemen and the gentlemanly, and to have captivated him flattered her much. It flattered her so much that, even if he had attempted to improve her mind, she would have cheerfully submitted for a time. Soon his visits were not limited to Sundays. Often he sat by the fire in Great Queen Street on Saturdays too. The Era was published on Saturday, and if he took in a copy of a paper that she could not afford to buy, she was frankly and joyously appreciative. It wasn't, "Thanks, that's very kind of you, I haven't seen it yet." It was, "You are a brick! I say it is good of you, we can't run to sixpenny papers." She pretended to surplus silver no more than to histrionic enthusiasm. For motives of self-aggrandisement she pretended nothing; she was spontaneity personified. She was spontaneity personified one Saturday when he arrived to be greeted with the news that her friend had just found an engagement. "Here, you're just in time. Come and congratulate her," she cried. "This girl has struck it rich. She has. She's going to play Mrs. Jocelyn in Mabel Go and Put on Your Hat." "Oh, I'm awfully glad," exclaimed Tatham, for it was an excellent part in a very successful West End comedy by a brilliant writer. "Isn't it jolly?" said Miss Knight. "I'm ever so pleased about it. It was only decided this morning. And I shan't have to give up these rooms at the start. That's another good thing, for it's for an 8 weeks' tour of the suburbs." "And afterwards?" "Afterwards we go into the provinces, perhaps. That isn't sure yet." "You'll be left here alone if she goes away," he said, turning to Peggy. "Oh, I don't know what I shall do if she goes away. I couldn't manage to keep on all this by myself. I'd have to put up with a combined room if I were still in town. But there's lots of time to worry about that. I may be in the provinces too before then. I say, I do think it's ripping, her getting such a swagger part." She was as genuinely elated as if she herself had been fortunate. "I hope you don't go into the provinces too," he said. "What'd become of me? It's very selfish of you to think of such a thing. The least you can do is to stand out for a London engagement." "Yes, likely. What price, mother? You'd better drop her a postcard, tell her she's to go on sending me money every week till I'm offered leading business up West. I see mother's face. How many changes have you got, Naomi? Have you got to find your own frocks?" "Yes, but I've got all I want, except the black. I can make my evening frock pass for clean if I cover it up with chiffon. You've seen the piece, Mr. Tatham, haven't you? What did you think of the way Miss Stevens played the scene in the third act? Do you remember?" "I thought she was very good. Didn't you?" "Yes, I thought she might have done rather more. I didn't think she brought out quite all there was in it. She didn't seem to me to go quite deep enough." "I suppose you'll have to copy her?" he asked. "It must be rather rough, the way all the people have to copy the performances of the London company, whether they want to or not." "I shan't, not altogether. I may have to do it at the rehearsals, but I shall give my own reading of the part at night." "Hear, hear," said Peggy. "Don't you be set on, old girl. I say, this wants celebrating. Hold on a minute, both of you. I shan't pay, I shall tell her to stick it on the bill." She darted out of the room, and reappeared 2 minutes later with bottles from the shop. "It's teetotal, I can't help that, she hasn't got a licence," she announced to Tatham. "You'll find tumblers in the cupboard. Don't upset the cruet, it's rocky." "There are only 2 there," said Naomi Knight. "I took up the other for our teeth." "Bring me a cup then." "No, I'll have the cup," said Tatham. "Give it to me." She struggled with him sincerely and was victorious. "Here's to Naomi." "Miss Naomi Knight." "Here's to everybody," laughed she. And then the importance of the part again, the name of the suburb they were to open in, the absorbing question of the chiffon, whether after all chiffon would conceal the shabbiness so well as lace. When he sat in the top bedroom that evening, in an armchair with a broken spring, blowing smoke musingly, Tatham wondered how the Bohemian scene would look on the stage if a playwright reproduced it there, wondered if there would be any atmosphere in it behind the footlights. 2 girls and a young man, all more or less penniless, drinking toasts to the future in ginger ale stuck upon the bill. A comedy, of course, and the younger hostess, Peggy, would be the heroine. The young man, presumably, would be the hero. One would have to make him something more interesting than a clerk at a hop merchant's. A rich man's son, estranged from his family and forgiven later. Nothing very original about that. Still, the hero must marry her at the end. He would have to get the money somehow. Earn it? Yes. What at? Frowning, smiling, with no definite purpose, he pondered the fancy that had come to him, began to discern the dim outline of a plot in it, became all at once unpractical, and was a popular dramatist, dizzy with triumph, dropped from Olympus with a bump onto the incipient plot, and found that it wouldn't do at all. He abandoned the matter. Ridiculous daydream. He resolved to think of something else, and discovered that the comedy was insistent. He jumped up and thrust a chair to the rickety table and slowly, laboriously proceeded to examine his fancy with pen and ink. So he took his first step to authorship. End of chapter 5. Book 1, Chapter 6 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Not the next incident in his acquaintance with Peggy Harper, but the next incident that always remained in his memory, was his travelling beside her in a tram full of dripping umbrellas, and sitting beside her in a suburban dress circle. Naomi Knight had obtained a pass for them. He had anticipated the evening with considerable eagerness. At every visit that he had paid during 3 weeks, he had listened to accounts of the rehearsals, heard discussions about her dresses; more than all, had been saturated in her views of her part. The intensity with which she had expatiated upon subtle points in it recurred to him painfully as he sat in the dress circle and found her to be entirely commonplace. The woman whose dramatic intelligence was so acute in the parlour displayed not the least touch of inspiration on the stage. She was mediocrity itself. He had a suspicion that Peggy did not think much of her either, although they both applauded loudly. The journey back was embarrassing to him. They all returned together, and the actress's unconsciousness of having failed to fulfil her conception of the character, her unconsciousness of how piteously far her executive powers fell short of her ideas, made answers to her questions extremely difficult. It was evident, however, that the halting falsehoods which he found himself uttering sounded sincere to her. Again she talked raptly of her reasons for delivering certain lines in a certain way, and the exposition was admirable — the exposition of an artist. She knew as much about the meaning of the part as the man who had written it. With bewilderment, Tatham remembered that the lines when she spoke them had made no impression on him whatever, that the intellect that she had brought to bear upon them would have been suspected by no one — because she couldn't act. It was the truth. She couldn't act. But the fact amazed him. He would have avoided going in with them when Great Queen Street was reached, but his excuses were overridden. There was a pork pie for supper, large enough for 3 appetites, and the quantity of beer in the jug showed that his presence at supper had been expected. Well, all the questions had been asked by this time. The party was pleasant enough. The fatigue to which Miss Knight had acknowledged in the tram disappeared at the table; it gave place to high spirits, the hilarity of a woman exhilarated by success. He had never seen her so animated before. The merriment of illusory triumph pealed and was infectious; by degrees he responded to it, was as talkative as his hostesses. He began to see that Peggy had by now come to feel what she wished to believe. He even ceased to remember that he had been deeply disappointed himself. After all, a first performance was nervous work. It was a scene of light-heartedness, endearments, and self-deception, a scene eminently typical of the world in which it took place. When Peggy went downstairs to let him out, 1 o'clock had struck. The staircase and the little shop were quite dark; but for the candle that she carried he would have been unable to see the way. The responsibility of bolts and chain had been entrusted to her by the householder, and at her bidding he held the candle while she fumbled with them. She appeared to find the task of unfastening the door a complicated one, and for an instant her cheek was so close to his face that all his self-control was necessary. As he strode up the wet street, he kept questioning whether she had given him any credit for the self-control, or thought him merely stupid. The girl shot the bolts moodily. At least half an hour ago she had decided that he should kiss her when they went downstairs, and the failure of her plan depressed her. Yet she did not think him stupid; she reflected again that he was a perfect gentleman. From his superior point of view, she realised, kissing her would mean a declaration. He couldn't go on coming here and kissing her and never ask her to be engaged to him. Lots of fellows would, of course, all the boys that she knew, just as often as she'd let them. But not Tatham. He wasn't their class. Still, It had been an awful sell. In one way it was a pity a gentleman was so particular, for she really was not certain that she wanted to marry him if he did ask her. She wanted him to kiss her, however, she hadn't any doubt about that. Her face was glum when she went back to the room. "You haven't been very quick about it," said Naomi Knight, facetiously inquiring. "Oh, rats!" she snapped. "Sorry I asked, my pet." "I don't know what you mean," said the girl tartly. "Nothing to lose your temper about then, is there?" "I'm not losing my temper at all. I suppose I can go downstairs to see a pal off without being badgered, can't I? Funny ideas you must have, I'm sure." Naomi Knight yawned. "I think it's time we went to bed. I don't know what's the matter with you all of a sudden." "Oh, there's nothing the matter with me," she exclaimed. "I'm tired, that's all. I want a cig. Where are they?" She found the remainder of a packet of cheap cigarettes on the mantelpiece and puffed one violently. "Oh, Naomi, I am such a fool. I've never been silly about anyone else. I think it's because he's so shy." Out of her knowledge the woman laughed shortly. "And they fancy we girls are so different from themselves." "What's that got to do with it? Do you think he'll ever say anything?" "Yes. What are you going to do if he does? You can't marry. I don't suppose he gets 30 bob a week." "He's in his uncle's office. Surely to goodness he gets more than that. Besides, I don't know. I don't know what I want, that's a fact. I've got the hump." "What you want is a jolly long tour. You'd be all right if you didn't see him for a few months." "Don't you think I like him?" "I don't think you're in love with him. You don't care about him really. And if you did, it wouldn't be important at 18. Oh, my dear, when one looks back! What does it amount to afterwards? One can't remember what colour his hair was. Time's rotten, Peg. Time's a beast. There was a fellow. Oh, well." "He's writing a play," said Peggy ruminatively. "Writing a play, is he?" "Of course, he hasn't much time, only the evenings. Still, authors do make money, don't they?" "Some of them do. What sort of play is it?" "A comedy. I don't see much in it myself what he told me. It's about the profession. Who cares about that? The people talk much the same as they do in real life. That's his idea. He wants to be as much like real life as he can. Who cares about real life? And the trouble the plot's giving him! Of course, he must do as he likes, but if I was an author, I'd write costume pieces about bygone times. You don't need to worry about the plot then. Any old thing'll do, if the people are dressed up quaint and talk old-fashioned. I daresay some costume pieces are all right, but look at most of them. My word, the public had got sick of those silly old plots before mother was born. They wouldn't run a night if it wasn't for the clothes and pretties." "I do protest the clothes are monstrous pleasing," smiled Miss Knight. "I'd like to read Tatham's piece. Has he shown you any of it? Ask him to lend you the first act if it's finished." It was then far from being finished, but when he came again and Peggy said, "I say, I should like to read your first act when it's done," the invitation was not one that he was likely to forget. So, nervously and proudly, a few weeks later, he left Act 1 in her hands for perusal, and spent all the evening picturing her absorbed by it, and wondering if he would receive a letter from her by the first post in the morning. And since an account for typewriting was an impossible indulgence before the act received revision, his stack of neat manuscript had been a forbidding object to her when she thanked him. Naomi Knight found it crumpled behind the sofa cushion next day, where Peggy had forgotten it, after a valiant but vain attempt which petered out at the 17th page. She did not own that she had forgotten it, still less would the sentimentality to which she had acknowledged allow her to admit that she had not read it. Her statement that she had "read it yesterday," and her subsequent pretence of finding the other's opinions of it in agreement with her own, was perhaps her earliest affectation. That her friend happened to be a better critic than an actress was fortunate for Peggy. Her Cockney shrewdness took full advantage of the fact. Though she did not deceive the woman for an instant, she deceived the young man continuously. In moments she deceived herself. She was enabled to discuss his work with an assurance that compensated to him for that appalling week during which he had waited, sick with suspense, for a letter that never came. She was at this period a companion to him, and he found nothing remarkable in the circumstances that her objections coincided with Naomi Knight's. It was to be expected that Miss Knight would influence her. Thanks to Miss Knight, she had occasional hints to offer. And again it was by no means astonishing that Miss Knight proved to be of the same mind with regard to them. If the tour of "Mabel, go and put on your hat" had been extended to the country, Peggy would have been severely embarrassed in her role of dramatic adviser, but it finished at Fulham, and the chief thing that daunted her now was the alarming length of her involuntary vacation. Mother's letter had drawn tears once, when he entered. "'Tisn't as if she didn't understand," she quavered. "She's been out often enough herself. She ought to know it isn't my fault. Great Scott! When I was with Morgan in Panto, she wouldn't have had a cent if it hadn't been for me. I paid all exes right through the season, and took out the muff and chain she'd pawned too. She's got no right to talk as she does." "Oh, well, don't cry," he said, moved. "You'll find something soon." "I'm not crying. I don't care. She can say what she jolly well likes. Talk about mothers! It's no thanks to her I'm Oh, well, I know her. She's got out of bed the wrong side, she wrote on one of her days. Next mail I'll get a long letter calling me Lovey. I'll Lovey her. She drove father silly. Father was a gentleman. He was. Father was never in the profession till he married. He only went into it afterwards. He and mother used to run their own companies when I was a kid. I can remember father, he always wore spats. I don't know what's going to become of me. I've had to drop my ads in the stage because I couldn't keep on paying the bob." "I can find a bob every week," he said. "Yes, it'd be all right, wouldn't it, you having to give it up yourself and paying for my ads afterwards?" "Advertising was no use to me anyhow. My name didn't say anything to managers when they saw it." "I don't know that it's much use to me, if it comes to that. Still, I always do advertise when I've got the money to spare. There's just a chance of your name being seen by someone who's got a vacancy and knows what you can do." She consented to write the advertisement presently, and he left it with a shilling at the stage office on his way back to the rickety table. The table wobbled under his hand into the small hours now, persistently escaping from the wads of paper that he placed beneath its legs, and his landlady made an extra charge in the bills for his unconscionable demands upon the gas. Often he took his way to the city sleepily, and it seemed anomalous, now that he grudged each hour there as an encroachment upon precious time, that he was able to fulfil a clerk's duties with a lighter heart. But lighter it was. With the private interest, the new hope to sustain him, he felt more cheerful in the city than he had felt since his initiation. The day might be as gloomy, but the prospect had brightened. There was, in moments, something not unfriendly in the glimpse of the wall and the water pipe across the red backs of the accountant books. It was a transparent wall that revealed a future. If the prettiest lines of the dialogue that he had accomplished in the bedroom overnight often intruded next morning when he was perched, casting figures, in the office, their clandestine visit was not without a charm. The office was no sadder for their caress, and his additions weren't much the slower for it. What Tatham needed pressingly, and had needed pressingly from the moment of his reluctant introduction to hops, was a man's companionship. He was alone. And just as he had exaggerated Peggy in the dreariness of solitude, he exaggerated her now in the eagerness of ambition. Her charm was no longer the mere ray of limelight that she shed. Authorship had increased, not diminished, his need of companionship. There were hours, less the hours of difficulty than the effervescent hours of difficulty surmounted, when the society of a man who had the interest to listen and the ability to respond would have been a boon beyond price. A plain young woman called Naomi Knight could have supplied all that he in truth sought in Peggy, and have supplied it honestly, but Peggy and she were "pals" in their vernacular, so she supplied no more than echoes. And there was another late evening when the dairy and refreshment rooms slumbered when he left. As it happened, they had not been talking much of his comedy that evening; they had been talking of the letters from Peggy's mother. For some little time all of them had been written on the lady's "days," apparently. The girl's eyes were red. She said nothing as she tiptoed down the stairs. In the parlour, only Naomi's presence had prevented a demonstration of his sympathy. In the darkness of the shop he paused and turned. "Do buck up, little girl," he begged under his breath. "I hate leaving you like this." "I'm all right," she muttered. "I wish I could lend you the money so that you needn't take any from her. You know I haven't got it." "What next? Why should you?" "That isn't it. Do you understand I haven't got it?" "Of course I understand. Don't look like that, you needn't worry about me." "I am worrying. You don't know how sorry I am for you." "Are you?" Her face was spiritualized in the candlelight, the girlish figure drooped pathetically. He took the candlestick from her hand and put it on the counter, and she didn't ask him why. "Peggy," he exclaimed, and she was sobbing on his shoulder. "Don't, Kitty. I love you." She sobbed more unrestrainedly. He stroked her hair, and kissed her on the cheek, stammering empty phrases of encouragement. Empty as they were, they calmed her. She was smiling when she raised her head. "I love you," he said again, thinking it true, and kissed her on the lips. After the silence, "I don't care now," she said. She was radiant, though her lashes glistened. She stood at arm's length from him, regarding him triumphantly. "Will you wait till we can marry?" Quick nods gave answer. "Even if it's a long time? It will be a long time, Peggy." "I expect it will." "You see, I'm not alone. I've got to help my mother. My salary doesn't do much for me." "Lot of mothers, aren't there?" she pouted playfully. "There's the comedy." "Oh yes, if I get the comedy taken, if it's a success, we shall be as right as rain. You'll give up the stage then, won't you? I don't want you to go on acting when we're married." "When we're married," she hummed from the Belle of New York. "Oh, I'll give it up, never fear. When we're married, what will you do? I'll be so tender and faithful to you. Are those the right words? They sound good enough, don't they?" "They sound lovely," he cried, but there was something lacking in his tone. "Shh! Don't talk so loud. We shall wake Mrs. Tucker. She sleeps downstairs." She laughed softly. "Things do change, don't they? Who'd have thought 5 minutes ago? Naomi won't know me when I go back." "What'll she say? Will she—" "What?" "Say you're foolish?" "She knows that already." "What, about me? Why, does she guess then?" "What do you think? Naomi thought you liked me the first time you came. Did you?" "Of course I did," he said, though he couldn't remember very clearly. He was conscious of feeling less emotion than he would have expected, conscious of being more self-possessed. He kissed her again, to stimulate his ardour. "Well, is she against it?" "Why should she be?" "Only the waiting." "Oh, well, I'm not in a hurry. Leastwise—" He winced, and despised himself for wincing, while her arms were round his neck. "You should be in a hurry," he said, humorously indignant. "Well, I won't put it off when you're ready. How's that?" "That's better. And you won't get tired of being engaged to me, either? It'll be the longest engagement you've ever had." "I say, I can write and tell Mother I've found one at last. Now ask me if Mother's going to be against it. It'd make a lot of difference if she was. But won't it suit her all right to get somebody to take me off her hands? Best bit of luck that's come Mother's way for a long time." He said meditatively, "I don't think I shall like your mother." "I'll bet you do, if you don't see too much of her. She's much more popular in a company than I am, till the tour's about half over. Then she generally has rows. I never knew Mother to say no to a subscription. She's awfully good natured to strangers. What about yours? She won't be keen on it, will she?" "I don't know why she should mind. We aren't together as it is. It won't make any difference to what I do for her. I suppose I ought to say good night." "I suppose so," she assented grudgingly, "or we shall have Naomi coming down to see what we're up to. Hullo, the candle's going out. It'll be blind man's holiday." "Can you manage the door? I'll come up with you and get another light. Yes, I'll go up again too, then we can tell her together. I think I'd like to do that." "Would you? What for?" "I think I'd better do that," he said. The wick of the candle stump had dropped. The china glowed redly for a moment, and then faded out of view. She put her hand on his, cautioning him to mind the step, enjoining him not to make a noise. Naomi was standing by the parlour mantelpiece, taking down her hair, and jerked round as she saw his reflection in the glass. "You needn't mind him," cried Peggy hilariously. "We're engaged." Chapter 6